like to welcome you on our next panel, titled as Enhancing Social Cohesion and Economic Convergence in the EU Neighborhood. I am Nina Abzianidze. I'm a professor, associate professor of political science at the Georgian Institute of Public Affairs in Tbilisi, Georgia, and I also work as a senior researcher for PMC Research Center, who is involved in InvigoratEU. It is my honor to be moderating the panel today, which hosts such a distinguished list of speakers. We're less in numbers compared to the previous panel, but nevertheless, I think we will have some interesting inputs. So we have gathered here to discuss opportunities, but also some challenges that the accession process brings with itself for the candidate countries of Eastern Neighbourhood and the Western Balkans with regard to social cohesion and economic development. More specifically, we aim at exploring the linkages between the EU accession process on the one hand and promoting legal and social convergence, mitigating socioeconomic inequalities, and strengthening social cohesion on the other hand. So we would like to discuss some obstacles, best practices, and the role of EU institutions and policies for inclusive integration process. So for that matter, we have three speakers from academic and policy community. And I briefly introduce our speakers. It's my pleasure to introduce Ivanka Lakova, who is a highly experienced EU policy expert with a career spanning over more than 25 years in European institutions and international consultancy. She has held key roles in the European Commission, particularly in DG Dev, DG NEAR, and DG Regio, where she currently coordinates enlargement negotiations. Our next speaker is Georgi Christovani, who is senior researcher at the PMC Research Center and an associate professor at Ilia State University in Tbilisi, Georgia. Holding PhD in economics from the University of Bremen, Georgi brings over 15 years of professional experience across the public, private, and non-governmental sectors, both in Georgia and internationally. Last but not least, we are honored to have Professor Frank Schimmelpfennig on our panel. I guess everyone who has worked on Europeanization has heard his name. He is a professor at ETH, professor of European politics at ETH Zurich. He is also a member of Research Council of the Swiss National Science Foundation, an associate of the Robert Schuman Center, and advanced studies at the European University Institute. So before I address our speakers with questions, I would like to, in a way, set a scene for our discussion. We decided to structure this discussion in a way as a dialogue between academic community and the EU in order to provide, for both to provide inputs regarding the interrelationship between accession process and strengthening social cohesion in candidate countries of Eastern Neighbourhood and Western Balkans. However, when we speak, as social cohesion is the central concept that we are going to address, we need to make a couple of clarifications, I suppose, because it is in a way a bit of an elusive concept. On the one hand, it can stretch very easily and cover enormous amount of indicators. On the other hand, it can also be approached in a very narrow, with a very narrow perspective pertaining to only socioeconomic inequality. So before we start discussing it, is important to agree on what do we mean when we talk of social cohesion. While EU perspective seems to be leaning more towards the narrower understanding of social cohesion, focusing mostly on socioeconomic inequality. In InvigoratEU, we decided to conceptualize it in a more rather broad way. And while we do take socioeconomic inequality as its main pillar, we also maintain that beyond this, it also consists of additional elements, such as social and political participation, belonging, acceptance of others, and trust. So we acknowledge that social cohesion has objective dimensions that basically is articulated in numbers of different aspects, but it also has subjective dimension, articulated in the perceptions of members of the society, like how cohesive the society feels for its members. And besides that, it also has, according to our understanding, social cohesion can be horizontal, in a way cohesion between citizens, but also it can be vertical, articulated in the trust between citizens, or rather trust of citizens towards their governing institutions. Having said all this, I would like to move to our first speaker with my question. And I think it would be logical if Ivanka starts the discussion. And what I want to ask to Ivanka is basically to give us an overview of what is EU's role in promoting social cohesion in accession states of Eastern neighborhood countries and Western Balkans. And maybe before answering the question, if you have something to add to the conceptual aspect of social cohesion, maybe EU has a different understanding of it. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nina. Let's hear the mics, because I was sitting at the previous panel at the end. Everyone hears well? It's audible? Very good. Thank you very much, first of all, for having me here, and I'm really thrilled to be here and to see such a vibrant audience. I heard a few parts of the discussion from the previous panel, so I'm really, really thrilled to be here. So, Nina, to answer your question, how we, the EU, as policy makers see social cohesion, I would say first I would have nothing to add or contradict what you said, but just underline the importance of institutions which we are based on and which we work with, whether it's in the member states or in candidate countries. But the human dimension and the fabric of society is a completely undistinguishable part of the institutional setup, in as much as institutions, state institutions, are reflective of the quality of the people. Closer. Oh, yes. Now okay. So I don't need to repeat, right? Yeah, so basically institutions matter, systems matter, but systems and institutions are composed of people, of humans, of their interactions, of their objective and subjective feelings of and perceptions of each other, hence the horizontal aspect that Nina mentioned, and also the vertical aspect, because we all live in societies, even tribal societies have leaders and followers and instigators and quiet or less quiet participants. So I would say throughout my interaction with you here today and throughout my expose, you will hear a lot about the quality of the state, law, because this is what governs a country, and this is what makes me as a citizen be completely safe by going and, for instance, leaving my money in a bank account and entrusting it to people I don't know, because I know behind it there's a huge system of laws and obligations, a banking system that is based on people, but also on institutions and rules. So all of these things are really extremely important in how we view a country and a state. And it's hugely important as well on how we categorize certain countries as developed, others as underdeveloped, and a third group as developing. And when we speak about enlargement to the east and the Western Balkans, and I will close my introduction here with this, let's please all keep in mind the very diverse, I can say it because I'm Bulgarian, I'm Balkan myself, so I will say it very openly. The history and the political and societal forces that have been driving the Balkans and Eastern Europe are completely different to the conditions, pressures, and impacts, positive and negative, that have been driving the development of the Western world as we know it. And hence, for me, political development precedes economic development. Economic development would be a result of political development. And of course, they feed one another. but the importance of developing the societal fabric through everything that Nina mentioned is, for me, a crucial importance. And you can see it in some of what the European Union does. In some ways, we do it really well. In others, we do it much less well, and there's quite a bit of room for improvement there. But the focus on institutions is not the only one, and I was hearing the questions on Georgia, how do we now withdraw from supporting the establishment in Georgia, but how we're not leaving the people behind. This is one of the things that I would like to come back to in the discussion we'll have. Thank you very much for now. Passing on the floor to Nina.
Thank you, Ivanka. Well, my next question goes to Professor Schimmelpfennig, and it's mostly about the trends in it's about the legal and social convergence in the accession countries of Eastern Neighbourhood and Western Balkans. So we wanted to hear from you, given your rich experience and expertise, what would be the main trends and best practices or major challenges that you would highlight in this respect?
Yeah, thank you, Nina. I must say, on this topic, the experience is not so rich. And that has a lot to do with the fact that this social dimension of Europeanization or convergence has not really been either in the focus of policy or in the focus of research on Europeanization. And say part of the interest of our part of the project was to learn more about this. So there's currently we just have very preliminary finding. There's not a very rich literature either, but there are some points and trends that I can highlight. So I think the most basic fact that we have to acknowledge here is that the reason why social policy or social legal convergence in the dimension of social policy has rather than been neglected in EU enlargement is the fact that this is indeed also not a core policy of the European Union itself. So social and welfare state policies are still very much the domain of the member states. It's typically a major expenditure policy, and what we know, of course, is that the EU does not have the resources to engage in that policy. Therefore, it's mainly regulation in the domain of social rights and labor relations. What we see is a rather thin acquis with a lot of soft law in this area, also much imported from other organizations such as the International Labour Organization, and a traditional focus on the rights of the movers within the internal market. Another point to mention is, okay, even when enlargement policy was very much driven by the transformational logic of modernization, democratization, this was not a strong point of EU enlargement policy. Now that the EU is shifting, as we've heard, more to a geopolitical logic, of course, that doesn't help with the agenda of social policy. One of the preliminary findings, and also what we find in part of the literature, is something that, of course, is well known from other policy areas, and that is, quite a discrepancy between the legal and practical implementation of policy in this area. Those studies that we've had on social policy or legal convergence in the social dimension from the Eastern enlargement have showed that it came rather late in the process. Implementation was delayed and often remained on paper. We do see that accession conditionality does drive legislative changes in these areas, but often it's formal compliance, quite selective, quite opportunistic. Implementation is rather sporadic. On the one hand, because the acquis is so sparse, legal harmonization should be done easily, but implementation is a different thing. There are a number of factors that explain this picture, in my view. One is, of course, since this is an area that has, say, rather low salience for the European Union, if you compare it for rule of law and other issues, of course, there's also less attention to actual implementation. Also, what the issue with implementation here, of course, is that it's mainly about the relations between non-state actors, employers, employees. So what you would need in order to shape that on the ground, is, let's say, for instance, a significant labor inspection staff. We know that because of administrative weakness, many of the candidate countries do not have the staff to actually do this. Trade unions are typically weaker in the candidate countries than in the old member state. There's quite a high degree of informality in the economy that also is an obstacle in this case. Even though the social acquis is predominantly regulatory, these are regulations that have costs. They create demands on the welfare state, but they also have economic costs. I mean, basically, they might be detrimental to the competitiveness of the candidate countries. Of course, one of the main attractions for investment, of course, is exactly, let's say, lower labor costs in the candidate countries. And of course, higher regulation means more costs, so there's a bit of an adverse incentive structure in this area. And of course, these are costs that the EU cannot really compensate for. So I will end here just by pointing out why I think even though the social dimension has gained a bit more importance on paper, there's more emphasis in that also in the Commission documents. But what I try to point out is basically the practical obstacles on the ground in really making a difference in this policy area.
Thank you very much for such an informative input. And next question goes to Georgi. Taking all this into account, we did say already before that socioeconomic inequality is the major pillar that we address through social cohesion. So what would your input be regarding the trends in this direction? How does accession process affect the major trends of socioeconomic inequality in the countries that we talk about?
Thank you, Nina. Hello, everybody. First of all, I'm happy to be here, and thank you very much to TEPSA and the organizers to invite me. I have some data, so it might take a bit longer than 4 minutes, and I hope moderator will excuse so. And when I will talk about socioeconomic inequality, and I will bring up some trends, and I will highlight 5 key dimensions here of socioeconomic inequality, and those are regional disparities, labor and education challenges. I will talk about governance issues, migration impacts, and finally about the role of EU accession process itself as a catalyst for changes. And first, the big picture. And the big picture is that there remains a persistent income gap between these aspiring member countries in Western Balkans and Eastern Neighbourhood and the EU average. And even the most advanced Western Balkan economies reach only around 40% of the EU's GDP per capita in average. And also it's important to highlight that the convergence has been slow, and according to research, the gap only narrowed approximately 11 percentage points in 2 decades. Regarding inequality measures, and I will talk here about most famous one, Gini coefficient, where most countries in Western Balkans and Eastern Neighbourhood exhibit greater income inequality than EU countries. And EU average is around 29.5, and the average in Western Balkans and Eastern Neighbourhood is around 31. But it's important to highlight that in majority of the Western Balkans and Eastern Neighborhood countries, there is a declining trend in inequality. When we're talking about regional disparities, it's, I think, important to highlight that the capital city and the few urban centers are far ahead of other areas in Western Balkans and Eastern Neighborhood. And if you take, for instance, Serbia, Belgrade and its surrounding region generate about 40% of the country's entire GDP, and it is even higher in Georgia, where Tbilisi generates almost 55% of GDP. Unemployment also remains a tough challenge in many of these countries, and the unemployment rate ranges between 9%, the lowest one is 9% and 40%, although in almost all countries there is a declining trend in unemployment, and we have one exception here, it's Moldova. Here we have unemployment rate of approximately 4%. And to compare with EU averages, the same rate is in EU approximately 6%. I think more concerning in this regard is youth unemployment rates and so-called NEET rates. And in case of youth unemployment, roughly 1 in 3 young people is unemployed and looking for work in Western Balkans and Eastern Neighborhood, and it's double the youth unemployment rate, which is approximately 15%. And on top of that, long-term unemployment is a phenomena which is present in candidate countries. It's about being jobless for over a year. And in Georgia, for example, around 7% of the labor force has been unemployed long-term, which is several times higher than the rate in the EU. Also, women participation and in general labor force participation is below EU average, but in case of women participation, it's significantly below. And to illustrate, for instance, in Kosovo, historically only 1 in 5 working age women have been employed or seeking work, though this is slowly improving. Regarding education, we have a following picture in candidate countries. On the one hand, while school enrollment rates and the quality of school infrastructure are decent, the quality of education varies. And international assessments show that students in these regions falling behind their EU peers. And for instance, we can take PISA test. And for example, several Western Balkan countries score around 400 points in reading and math, whereas EU and OECD average is about 500. Let's move to governance and institutions. To start with corruption and weak governance remain major obstacles in both the Western Balkans and Eastern Neighborhood, and also the public perception of corruption is high. And we can say that and indicate that this inefficient governance also means social benefits might not reach those who need them, and public services like health and education might suffer. I think it's also important to highlight the migration and demographic trends, and the data allows us to say that emigration is both the symptom and also a factor of inequality in Western Balkans and Eastern Neighborhood. Today, about 1/5 of the Western Balkan population lives abroad. For instance, in case of Moldova, the population have shrunk since 1989 by almost 1/3, and Georgia's population shrunk by approximately 20% in the last 30 years, mainly due to emigration. And that's why it's not a surprise that the emigration has led to heavy dependence on remittances in those countries. And remittances make up over 10% of GDP in several countries in Western Balkans and Eastern Neighborhood, and in top 30 worldwide in remittances to GDP ratio, 6 countries are from Western Balkans and Eastern Neighbourhood: Kosovo, Albania, Moldova, Montenegro, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Georgia. And at the same time, low birth rates and continued out-migration mean these societies are aging and shrinking, which could exacerbate socioeconomic imbalances. And for instance, percentage of population in Western Balkans and Eastern Neighborhood above 65 is approximately 17%. And if you compare with EU average, here in EU it is about 21.5%. So it's not a big difference. And to conclude, I need 1 minute. To conclude, I believe that Eastern Neighborhood and Western Balkans are at a crossroads at this point. They have endured a difficult transition over the last 30 years, and they have emerged with functioning economies and societies that aspire to European standards. And inequality, both within these countries and between them and the EU, remains a pressing concern. But at the same time, it's not static. And we see positive trends like decline in poverty in some countries, increasing female labor participation, and most importantly, growth, economic growth in recent years slightly outpaced the EU average, and the poverty rates have been on a downward. And to conclude, I think it's fair to say that EU accession process is a key catalyst for change in the Western Balkans and Eastern Neighborhood, and this perspective of becoming a EU member country can give those candidate countries a massive and maybe most important push for further decrease in socioeconomic inequality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Georgi. It indeed took more time than expected, but you gave such an informative or rich information that I think it was worth of it. Now that we have mapped all these issues, I would like to add an additional layer to our discussion. We have mentioned many times on our previous panels the hybridity of the situation right now and the threats that have been let's say restructured, geopolitical threats that have been restructured in recent years for the candidate countries that we're talking about. When we were researching the literature on social cohesion, we found out that literature discusses a couple of factors through which accession process can affect social cohesion. Very frequently discuss mechanisms through which this influence happens is the democratization, like improving the democracy, market integration through different mechanisms, and also mobility as a factor that can influence social cohesion. But we have never come across in a literature to the discussion of geopolitics affecting in any way social cohesion. But what we witnessed in these countries is that, so we do have some preliminary data in across the cases that we're studying, and we see that one of the things that has that has resulted from the restructuring of geopolitical threats is the polarization, very strong political polarization in these countries. And clearly polarization is a detrimental aspect to social cohesion. So because this hasn't been discussed much in literature, I thought this would be the perfect place to bring this up and bring political polarization as a result of the new geopolitical shifts in the world that affects those countries so much, to bring it in this discussion and ask to all of you. Basically, this question goes to all three of you. How do you think can EU mitigate this new reality, if EU can at all mitigate this new reality? Maybe we start in the same order. Ivanka, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My personal contention would be that political polarization in these countries is not any bigger or smaller than it really is elsewhere. Of course, if I compare it to sub-Saharan Africa, the mere rate of connectedness there and the mere rate of what preoccupies the minds of people there is completely different to what it does in the Western, including the Eastern world. I wouldn't say polarization is bigger here, but I would say that polarization is one of the biggest dangers, but not because of polarization itself. It's because of the fact that people do not stop to think for a minute when they think, oh, this is politics, this doesn't interest me, and I have nothing to say, and I don't want to say it because this is politics. Politics affects us all down to the very single minute of every single day we live. And it's not because someone would decide not to follow the news, which are really depressing these days, that's for sure, that they should withdraw themselves from the public and policy life of their country. But I think this is what more often than not happens, that the politicization that people think of in their minds is in terms of global trends and global orientation, and in those things most people feel absolutely helpless, and the easy way out is I withdraw from this so I don't have to get bogged down at this. So it's in this way that polarization, not necessarily in the old left and right ends of the spectrum, this is where, for me, this is the most visible danger of all. And I think what the EU can do there, but it cannot do everything, because again, through what we're doing, through enlargement and through all the other line policies, which we mentioned at the beginning that enlargement is not as heavily regulated policy, if we can call it policy at all. But what the EU can do there is what I think we are already doing, is through the formal and informal processes. So there's a formal negotiation process with each of the candidate countries. Their programs, quite substantial financial allocations to the candidate countries, but it's not so much the finances that are important, it's the fact that these countries get to get a picture of what it means to be part of an implementation of a European program. What kind of institutions do I need for it? What kind of written and unwritten norms do I have to be part of my society and of my political setup in order for me to be able to reap the benefits of these funds that are coming? All the thematic and sectoral supports to civil society, to local authorities, whether in development or enlargement. So all of these simultaneous avenues, I think, are providing quite a bit of a picture and a playing ground, a sandbox, if we can call it, for those who want to hear and for those who want to test and play. For those who want, there's nothing we can do. Like people who don't want to become self-aware, there's not much we can do about motivating them to change. But we can motivate those who want to change and who, by observation and by testing it in the sandbox, can do it through the tools that that the institutions put at the disposal of the candidate countries. I think I've said enough. Thank you.
Thank you. We move with the same question to Professor Schimmelpfennig.
Yeah, I mean, to tell you my conclusion first. I don't think the EU can really do much about it. And it has to do with the fact that the policies that states use to address these issues, which is welfare state, social policies, education policies, are basically national policies. And the EU has a rather minor role in that. So I think here let's say the problems are to some extent created through the European integration of markets and the opening of boundaries, whereas the solutions still need to be mainly provided at the national level. And this is a tension that I don't see can really be overcome, at least not in the short term. So I mean, the formula would be okay. Markets, migration. It's transnational. The politics and the policy in this area is still very much national. And of course, we see these effects in many ways. Yeah? And so, I mean, for instance, Ivan Krastiev has done a number of very important studies. Yeah, how, let's say, how European integration, of course, creates chances and opportunities for many. Yeah, but especially, of course, for the high skilled, and offers them opportunities, yeah, to find jobs outside of their country, which, however, at the same time creates a feeling of being left behind for those, yeah, that are, let's say, more low skilled and local and do not benefit from this. And this, as we've seen in many not only new member states, but in many member states, creates a backlash. I mean, just I mean, this issue of say, levels of education and migration. Just an anecdote, yeah, from where I work in Zurich. Of course, I mean, with the recent Romanian elections, there's also diaspora elections, and earlier on, what we could observe is that the diaspora overwhelmingly voted in favor of, let's say, more liberal or Europe-friendly forces. Now, with the Romanian elections, we've seen quite an interesting split, yeah, because it's easy to find out, let's say, where the low-skilled Romanian workers vote and where the high-skilled ones that work for Google and so on, where they vote. And we see a complete split in the vote. Yeah, so I think in terms of polarization, I thought this was an interesting anecdote, and I'm sure that doesn't just apply to the Romanian diaspora. But as I said, I mean, I lack the imagination to think, okay, what can the EU proper do about it? Okay.
Thank you. And Georgi, I asked the same question, but I would also like, because you also come from Georgia, you witness with your eyes how this polarization works out. Maybe you could also add a couple of words regarding how political elites are instrumentalizing this whole situation to, exacerbate the polarization. Yeah.
Yes, of course. First, I think that, of course, the EU can solve every problem here, but at least how I observe the situation based on Georgian experience, and I guess Levan mentioned that as well during his panel, that EU was mostly concentrated in Georgia-EU partnership on institutional reforms, on governance reforms, on economic reforms, and less when it was about political education, less when it was about media independence, less when it was about civil society development. And I think that what EU can do and should do is that put more focus in its handling with candidate countries on issues beyond institutional transformation and economic, let's say, transformation and adjustments to EU policies. And I think this might help, because what we now witnessing in Georgia is that basically, and if you look on data, on different indexes, and what, for instance, Georgian government is emphasizing in its efforts to, let's say, criticize EU, is that in all institutional development measures, and Georgia is far ahead of maybe other countries, at least in Eastern neighborhood, and we are now behind in our accession process, and it is unfair, and it is not justified, and we are, let's say, we are not happy with that. And I think that EU should act more with the society as well. And we hear often that, and in almost every speech from EU representatives, we hear that EU stands with Georgian people, and I think that it would be also nice to talk with Georgian people as well, and to have platforms where this dialogue with different players besides state actors should be there. Related to participants, what I can observe based on Georgian perspective is that Georgian ruling party learned quite well to get benefits from this political polarization, and it's mostly ahead of opposition, ahead of civil society in that, and in this regard I think that EU's approach towards candidate countries should anticipate that the practices how to incentivize political polarization in autocratic governance are much more advanced, and it's not a peculiar case of certain political figure that handling is leading to political polarization. It's kind of a very well planned strategy of polarizing society and gaining benefits from that. Thank you.
Thank you. And now that we just went into a very deep discussion and very interesting questions pop up, we still need to wrap this discussion up with final question if we want to have some time for the Q&A session. And I think because we wanted this to be like a dialogue, our last question basically is what can each side of the dialogue do better? So we will start with Frank and Georgi regarding the question, what could EU do better, basically? And then we would move to Ivanka with the same question, but with a different focus. What could academia do better for EU to give better inputs or to support the process in a more effective way? So maybe... Yep.
In this case, I will be more brief, and I think that still research on social cohesion, which is part of our role in Invigorate project, showed that it's still very much dominated through economic elements and socio-economic elements, and this human element, which Ivanka mentioned, is still less relevant. And I think that when dealing with candidate countries, and I think that EU should put more emphasis on this human element and less on just socio-economic part of cohesion. And I think it will be, and cohesion as such in the European discussion should be more and more focused on this horizontal and vertical cohesion on human element and rather than economic one.
Yeah, so in the narrow domain of what we are doing research on, which is, say, compliance with the social dimension, with the social acquis. I mean, as I said, the big issue is the discrepancy between formal adoption of laws and their practical implementation. And we know that the formal adoption of laws is very much driven indeed by the conditionality and the need to adopt those laws in order to fulfill the accession conditions. So I think it would indeed be extremely helpful to do two things. Yeah? One is for the EU, to the extent possible, to follow up not just to see this as a box-ticking exercise, but to also look into how this is actually implemented. But of course, the EU also needs to do something about, let's say, the weakness of domestic structures. So it should provide support to those domestic actors that, in the end, would be, say, in the best place to make sure that employers or the state actually implements these things. So this could be I mean, support to trade unions, support in terms of legal advice. Not quite sure how much is actually done in this respect, but in the end, of course, what you don't want is that it is the responsibility of the EU to make sure that these laws are implemented, but you want to strengthen those domestic actors that in a well-functioning society would be the ones advocating and pursuing the issue.
Thank you.
Yep, I couldn't agree more on the fact of, in those countries, the institutional fragility, the legacy of conflict, and the huge amount of informal economies is so pervasive and so big indeed that we are supporting institutions. We are less supporting, because they're much tougher to identify, the stepping stones that are going to be the building blocks for the social fabric that I was speaking at the beginning. But yeah, I couldn't agree more with this. On my side, what I think academia and research can do to better support us as policymakers, but also national policymakers, there's one thing I want to mention because it's relevant to this question, is I have been for 15 years an evaluator for the Commission, World Bank, IMF, and mainly in Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, where we were evaluating country assistance strategies and how development cooperation is bringing those countries out of poverty. 20 years down the line, zero impact, because we have been literally pouring water into the sand. Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, Malawi, all these countries where international development assistance, ODA, has represented 50 to 60% of GDP, not of public investment, like, for instance, the cohesion funds represent in some of the member states of the Union. But I'm saying all this, and I'm giving this backflash into it to say the amount and the quality of insight, data, is still very much lacking. And now I'm going to speak about enlargement and Western Balkans and the East. I think academia and research, if you can better involve policymakers and hold them accountable, I know that unless you have a legal basis, you cannot hold someone else accountable. But if you manage to get them on board and to, we were speaking with Frank at the beginning, going beyond the slogans and going into the nitty-gritty of the things and saying, okay, you're telling me, for instance, that if I push the implementation of this onto the local authorities in these countries, I'm going to increase local ownership. And I always ask the question, how? Well, it's because they will implement. How are you going to increase local ownership when these institutions have shown us that even for the low-level brain power, they're not equipped because of the institutional fragility that is endemic? How, by pushing something more complex, we are miraculously and automatically going to increase local ownership? So in that kind of questions, and this is what I do in my institution every day, when I hear slogans, I tell people, tell me, if I were looking, what would I see? I know it's not a very easy example to take from this context and put it into what you can do with policymakers, but if you can try to be instigating this level of thought and connectedness between academia, think tanks, I count them in as well, research and policymakers, whether it's at the local or the central level, that's one thing. I personally am missing a lot of the availability of longitudinal data, because we have a lot of snapshot. We have, and Georgi mentioned amazing figures in his earlier expose, but I think, and this is where it links it with the human element as well, if we can have this longitudinal data that informs on perceptions and the way they shift, not necessarily how the EU or how other elements or institutions impact social cohesion, but let's even take this for an example. Being able to track causality and being able to establish trends and being able to say, guys, this is what works and this is what doesn't, and no matter how you are attached to your slogans, let's forget about this because this doesn't work. And of course, the polarization and how the political parties in the Western Balkan countries and the East are instrumentalizing polarization doesn't help. But if the societal fabric gets stronger and stronger in its ability to demand checks and balances from their ruling parties, and the critical mass of these people becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, this is what is going to bring the politicians kind of not to their knees, but to know that they're there to serve. And until this happens, I don't think that, unfortunately, we're going to see in our eastern countries the level of democracy and the level of checks and balances that we're seeing in Western Europe, with all its current hiccups that we know, but the wheel is turning. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all the speakers for such an insightful, thought-provoking inputs. I think with this we can open up the floor for questions. I think we will collect a couple of questions. Maybe we start here with the gentleman. Please introduce also maybe yourself.
So thank you very much for this interesting panel. I have one question to Georgi Kishtovani. Thank you for providing this clear picture of disparities. My question would be, what do you think is the most important thumblestone, the most important critical issue for enlargement process? Is it the gap between the EU member states and the accession states, so the disparities between outsiders and insiders, or is it more the disparity within the accession states that makes the enlargement process such a critical process? So that's it. Thank you.
Are there other questions? Yeah, there.
It's both a question, I think, and also some kind of a comment, if I can, taking advantage of the fact that there is no other, at least. Don't you think that also, in terms of the cohesion issue, it's very important to look at the quality of sub-state governance and actors? That's one linked to some thoughts that I had while listening to your inspiring, I would say, comments, is that to start with, I'm not an expert on economic cohesion, but what we have been knowing cohesion from is the territorial cohesion aspect, which at the end aims at the social and economic. And there has been a lot of work done on that, on terms of the EU side. Not always with the expected results, we have to say, but there has been a lot of interreg and territorial cohesion policies that they are relevant to the neighborhood. And a final comment, based on what Nino said, there is a sense of awakening on part of the EU and looking into cohesion from a more geopolitical aspect. And I think we can see that in the global gateway, where there are elements there with sustainable growth and jobs priority, inclusion priority there as well. So we can see this getting, like the cohesion issues, being also viewed through, we can see some geopolitical thinking. And also in terms of what Georgi said, indeed, we have to look into more like social indicators rather than pure economic indicators in the cohesion. All there in the Interreg new approach, we can also see that increasingly more social indicators are included rather than pure economic and GDP, etc. Those are some comments. If you want also some thoughts, if you want to comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As long as I don't see hands. There, maybe third one, and then we answer the questions.
Thank you all for your points. Very, very interesting. Claudia Bodlescu from ULB. Maybe a point for Ivanka. Thank you very much for your remarks. Could you maybe think of what the EU could do through its enlargement and neighbourhood policies to stop or at least calm down the exodus of qualified young people from the Western Balkans, but not only, more widely from the neighbourhood? Thank you.
Thank you. I think let's follow the same order. The first question was to Georgi.
First of all, thank you very much for the question. I would say the following. First, what was obvious looking at data was that the, let's say, socioeconomic indicators in those candidate countries are quite similar. So, of course, they are not the same, but they are similar. And maybe this fact makes the parallel accession process in this respect easier to manage for EU. Of course, there are differences, but in general, I would say this is not an issue. So, let's say socioeconomic parameters of candidate countries in Western Balkans and Eastern neighborhood is not an issue for the process. What I lack a bit is that in this regard, the cooperation or coordination is less present for me from outsiders' perspective between the countries, how they can strengthen each other's efforts of accession. So it's rather kind of two groups, and then these two groups are also kind of not very homogeneous. Regarding this gap between EU average or an EU average and candidate countries, this is, I guess, an issue in a sense that if you take GDP per capita, the difference is quite big. So if all those countries who are now candidate countries in Western Balkans and Eastern neighborhood will join EU, those will be the maybe the countries with less income, and we would need much of support to catch up. But at the same time, in EU, we have countries with similar, of course higher, but similar income level. So it means that, and at the same time, if the majority of candidate countries are small ones, so it's not that if they parallelly join EU, it will be a huge growth in economic terms. Victor, I don't see him now, but yesterday made very good presentation about that it's the share of GDP, except Ukraine maybe because of this is a kind of outlier, is quite low for other candidate countries. And that's why of course there are structural differences, and for instance unemployment rates especially show quite good that economic structure is different in candidate countries rather than in EU. But it's not something which should be a huge problem, I guess, as well. And the EU has experience of expansion, and I guess a number of countries go through the similar pattern of restructuring in its economy. For instance, Croatia might be a good example for Western Balkan countries in this regard. To conclude, I don't see either first or second point as a huge problem for accession process. Rather, other aspects of, because we're doing about cohesion, rather aspects of cohesion for me are more problematic, I would say, than economic structure of candidate countries. Thank you. I hope I have answered your question.
The second one was more like a comment. Is anyone willing to respond? Yeah?
Yeah, since I think there was no question directed to me, I can
Yeah.
I can take it up. Yeah, I mean, you're touching on an area of, say, very controversial and indecisive knowledge and research. I mean, there's tons of studies out there that look at cohesion and its effects, and the results are quite inconclusive. Yeah, so yes, generally they show, yeah, that regions benefit from cohesion, but we don't really know whether this is causal. Yeah, there's quite solid evidence that indeed the quality of governance of government matters. Yeah, and we know that, of course, the way this funding is allocated and distributed in the member states is filtered through, say, party politics and relations between local governments and the national government. I mean, Hungary is just the tip of the iceberg, yeah, but it's a general pattern in the member states. Also, there have been studies looking at whether the allocation of cohesion fund makes voters from these regions vote more or less, let's say, less for Eurosceptic parties. Again, we don't really have conclusive evidence. But I mean, definitely your first point about, let's say, the quality of government and, let's say, the dependence or independence of local governments and the national government, I think we have some solid findings there.
Thank you. And the last question was directed to Ivanka.
Sorry, the last question I'll take, but I want to add a comment on the Interreg and the quality of government and institution across borders. So Interreg is a tool that was born out of the reality that border regions are left alone. Central governments don't care, even in federalized states where the local level has a lot of competencies. It's not that they don't care, but we are now into the 4th generation of Interreg, which in the meantime has also gone outside of the EU. There's Interreg Next, the Interreg IPA, and the IPA 3, IPA 2, which reminds me of a clarification I wanted to make on the unanimity vote from the previous panel, but I'll come to this later. The way Interreg funds are received is at the national level as part of the national envelope, and then they are given to the JTSs and the managing authorities in the segments that corresponds to this country or that country within the cross-border region. Because of the nature of Interreg, that part of it is supposed to be there to instigate cooperation, this has been, from my point of view, quite a drawback of Interreg, because it's only been concentrated on cooperation. Let's cooperate, let's create networks, as opposed to Interreg having been the instrument that was going to allow the local governments more say and more gaining terrain towards the central governments. And we, the Commission, are there, your most powerful ally, to say, guys, let's not just go to the nitty-gritty of let's cooperate, a number of projects done together, a number of cross-border companies that have designed a project. Let's use this tool and this leverage for us to help you push for getting more financial autonomy, more institutional and functional autonomy towards the central governments. Yes, it's going to take years, but unless we start, we're never going to get there. So Interreg being concentrated only on cooperation in its pure form is a bit the lesser child. So I always preach this when I go and speak at conferences. Try to keep in mind that Interreg, we can help the local governance structures gain some autonomy through this tool. And this tool should not only be used for for getting projects together. So that's my comment on this question. On the stopping the exodus, that's the million-dollar question. So the EU, the Commission is doing already something about it, but this something is like an aspirin compared to what the problem is, because the exodus, if I have to oversimplify to make the point, the exodus comes because the conditions for the higher educated and those who want to be involved and those who want to shake and move things, the conditions in our countries don't exist for them. So what do? They look to the West. The Commission has launched something called the Talent Booster Mechanism and the Harnessing Talent. There's a communication I can send you all the links as well, and I can connect you with people from DG Regio who is managing this thing on behalf of the Commission, which is basically a talent booster mechanism trying to see how to connect people from different places, different countries, what kind of technical assistance or support they may need in order to set up businesses, in order to reap some of the benefits of what they have started but haven't been able to do because they lacked skills or lacked access to funding or access to business incubator. But again, this is only palliative, because as long as the conditions, and this is why I always speak of the quality of the state and a state which is funded by a functioning tax system and cared by a functioning police and cared for by judges who don't take bribes. This is what's going to keep the brain drain, to stop the brain drain and keep young talents in those countries. But if you want, I can connect you with the colleagues who are working on this. It's a great try. It's not a panacea, but.
Thank you. Even though we are a bit, but we started a little late. I think if there are some pressing questions, we can afford one or two. If not, and I don't see hands, so I think with this we can wrap up. I would like to thank our speakers who gave us such an informative and insightful inputs, and also thank the audience for engagement, and the rest can be discussed over coffee, I guess. Thank you.